and welcome to a bonus episode of the Code Green podcast. We come back one final time this season to reflect on our learnings from this series on the intersection of AI and climate action. I'm Arvishya Neja, the founder and director of Digital Futures Lab, an India-based research organization that examines the impact of technology on society in the Global South through evidence-based research, systematic foresight, and public engagement. You can access the entire season of the podcast and our newsletter at codegreen.asia. The Code Green series was supported by Earth Venture Foundation, a not-for-profit initiative that supports scientific research to advance climate action. In 2023, Digital Futures Lab launched AI and Climate Futures in Asia to highlight regional perspectives on AI and climate. Back then, few were discussing this intersection. By 2025, the conversation has accelerated worldwide. We now see initiatives like the AI for Climate Action Innovation Factory and global grand challenges driving solutions to urgent environmental problems. At the same time, debates on AI's climate footprint are growing louder, from data centers training water resources in Texas to Mistral AI's pioneering life cycle disclosure in the EU. In Asia, momentum is building too. UNDP recently launched UNA, the world's first AI environment champion, and India has rolled out AI-powered climate advisory services for farmers. Yet tensions remain even in Asia. For example, AI chip manufacturing is fueling fossil fuel demand in Taiwan and South Korea, raising questions about whether AI risks undermining clean energy transitions in the region. Over the past year, Code Green has tried to cut through this complexity. Our conversations with experts surfaced 5 key takeaways. These include the need for A. Streamlining data minimization approaches into domains like conservation, collecting only as much data as needed. B. Adopting a fit-for-purpose approach to develop energy-efficient climate AI models by identifying AI's suitability for climate action and working towards reducing its carbon footprint. C. Building slow, using participatory methods in developing long-term partnerships with communities and grassroots organizations to surface problems from the ground up. D. Considering the long-term impacts of the physical infrastructures that AI needs. What are the environmental and human costs of building AI for climate? And finally, investing in critical AI and data literacy among climate sector stakeholders. This can help bridge knowledge gaps in AI's perceived benefits and limitations while promoting the responsible use of AI. So Dona, Tammanna, Meredith, it's so great to be talking to 3 of you as we've spent the past couple of months speaking to all kinds of experts in the space of AI and climate. And I'm really happy that we have this chance to actually go behind the scenes and, talk a little bit about the making of the podcast and also get your kind of bird's eye view on what we learned, what the gaps are, and where you think this conversation needs to go. And so maybe, Donna, I could start with you. You and I worked on a project before this, which was with the Rockefeller Foundation. We were looking at AI and climate futures in Asia. So do you want to say a little bit about, how Code Green came about, what the kind of linkage was between the work that we'd done with the Rockefeller Foundation and Code Green? What are the kind of questions you were trying to answer, the gap we were trying to fill?
Sure. Thanks for that. Just for some context, also for our listeners on the work that we did with the Rockefeller Foundation in 2023, responding to this almost lack of contextual knowledge on this intersection of AI and climate, because we'd been seeing some work on this intersection since around 2020 when GPI had set up the Responsible AI strategy group for the environment. And then there was the report that they did with climate change and AI. And we're seeing a lot of movement in this space. But a lot of that was dominated by conversations in the global north. So it was coming out of the US, it was coming out of Europe, but there was no contextual information that was coming out of Asia. So the goal with the Rockefeller project was to also bring in that kind of localized knowledge on this intersection. How do digital divides, infrastructure needs, financing needs kind of feed into this intersection in Asia, and to also kind of unpack some of the use cases that were already there, the R&D that we were seeing in that space. And what we did with that project was to bring together an expert network from across 9 countries to build that contextual knowledge, to talk to their expertise from the climate science background, from technology, people from academia who worked at both this intersection or specifically on AI ethics and governance. And then since the space was also so vast, we ended up focusing on 3 domains of agriculture, energy, and disaster response. And some of the key things that also emerged from our work was that, of course, there was a lot of R&D that was happening. There were pilots that were there in the agri space, in the energy sector for disaster response as well. But this also seemed like very nascent space, like an emerging space. So what that also led to was kind of code green, in the sense that we were able to identify some of the gaps in terms of the lack of spaces for interdisciplinary collaboration. There was research happening in silos across the region, but there was no way to actually surface that research, or like collaborative platforms to bring that research around. We'd also noticed like a lot of gaps in terms of data, in terms of data sharing mechanisms. So then what are some structures or frameworks needed to make sure that data flow is better, but then also kind of look at principles of data sovereignty, community ownership, all that. And to kind of also help investors in some sense, like the next generation of investors who want to look at climate tech, who want to invest in climate AI, to kind of identify both the potentials and the drawbacks of this technology, right? Like AI is not value neutral. What does it mean deploying AI in climate vulnerable context? So that was kind of like, I think, three main points that we were also trying to surface with Code Green as we built on our learnings from the Rockefeller work.
Yeah, I mean, I think also one of the things that really strikes me, maybe two things that really strike me about the work that we did with Rockefeller was that, when we started out doing that work, Donna, like the climate impacts of AI was a conversation really on the periphery, right? When we started talking about it, we were, it was almost like we were being alarmists or, just being too negative in some sense. And now, fast forward to today, it's become, it occupies center stage. Like I saw this morning, I was scrolling on LinkedIn and I saw that there's like some new Hollywood film that the setting is a town where there is these data centers coming up, and that's the kind of background, right? And so it's really interesting to also see how fast this space is moving, and how things that's, like just 2.5 years ago seemed like the on the margins now are kind of on the mainstream. But that being said, it's also, like the mainstream where, right? Like I think one of the things that we don't see in Asia, for an example, is that conversation around the climate impacts of AI being center stage in the Asian context, right? We see a lot more around the kind of innovation potential, etc., at least in terms of like the kind of dominant narrative. Which maybe brings me to, a second set of questions that I have, and maybe Meredith or Tamanna, you want to respond to it, which was just kind of to go behind the scenes on the making of this podcast, right? What were some of the kind of issues or challenges that you guys dealt with when you were trying to curate the speakers or identify kind of knowledge gaps in the region?
So navigating these gaps was definitely a challenge in some ways. And as you pointed out, this was also during a time when, all of these reports were coming out on the environmental costs of AI in real time. Even while working on the energy issue, news broke about Microsoft reopening 3 Mile Island. And, all of these questions, were coming up around, big tech stake in energy, like what role will technology play in the climate crisis and in addressing it. And I would say that in terms of navigating these gaps, the gaps that we were confronted by were more challenging in some domains than others, right? So in agriculture, for example, there was almost too much research in the region, and we had to really narrow our scope and be kind of picky about what we wanted to highlight and what we wanted to focus on. On the other hand, in domains like critical minerals and looking at, the material AI supply chain, it ended up being difficult to find experts that were at this nexus and to find research for the newsletter that was coming out of Asia. Tom and Tamara were really great. And the fact that they were both from the US was kind of telling of, the state of play in the region in that domain. What we really wanted to do with the podcast was to center perspectives from the Asian region, particularly from developing economies. And sometimes this just wasn't possible. As far as the process of working together, I felt like overall it was pretty collaborative and democratic. Sometimes it would be down to the wire with such short timelines for getting a handle on such broad topics. But we really brought each of our own strengths to the table and learned to build this muscle together, I feel like, to connect these different nodes. And I think we really grew to appreciate and rely on one another and what we would offer to the project. The last piece was it was definitely was chaotic at times. Sometimes the list of articles would be really long, and whoever was really excited about that particular domain would be tasked with creating a must read list so we could pick out kind of core threads of the narrative together. Overall, though, I would say that the gaps, while challenging, were indicative, and they also gave us an opportunity to be a bit creative in shaping the narrative and to kind of theorize, like what is happening in this space. And so that presented pretty meaningful opportunities as well for us as a team.
Just to also build off on like what Meredith was saying around critical minerals, that conversation in particular, the supply chain conversation, was a hard one to tackle for us in just finding the right people to kind of bring on board. And also since we were kind of working within like monthly deadlines, so we would have like about 2 weeks to kind of reach out to people, make sure that those coordinations also happen. We got their responses and we were able to like log them down for a conversation within those specific timelines. So finding those right sets of people also required a lot of background reading from our end in kind of figuring out where their perspectives lay, what's the kind of research that they were doing, and like you were saying, Urvashi, like finding that expertise within Asia was also often hard. So we'd often kind of then go back to reports by international organizations like the ADB or World Bank, some work that they've done in that space, and then try to also find authors, etc., who are working on that space. Because often then we might not be able to find, say, videos of people who are working in this space in Asia, which would then require us to like reach out to them, have those conversations, see their interest in speaking, how comfortable they are in speaking on that particular topic, but also like quite informational for us in that process itself, because then we are doing our own reading, and because there was a newsletter also accompanying the podcast, a lot of those readings are eventually also fed into the newsletter. And even if it was never planned that way, we'd often find a lot of feeding back and forth between the newsletter and podcast, so we could often use what the experts had said in the podcast back into the newsletter. But process wise, yeah, I mean, at the beginning it was of course very chaotic as we started out like figuring out this podcast, like the cadence of the podcast and the newsletters, considering there were like multiple moving parts also to the project. But I think collaboratively we would go down our own rabbit holes. We had like running Excel sheets with names on them, with profiles, backgrounds of people, and then come together and figure out, okay, shortlist folks that we can reach out to, and then figure those schedules out with them.
Yeah, and was there points at which you guys disagreed on what needs to be the content of the newsletter or the podcast, or who you should highlight?
I think I don't recall deadlocks. I don't know. Maybe Meredith and Tammanna have a different viewpoint on that. I think there was a lot of discussion for sure. Our scheduled 1 hour calls would usually go into 2.5 hours on a regular basis. So there's definitely a lot of room for discussion on what should go. And I like using the term "killing your darlings" was the hardest part of editing the newsletter, because all of us would write something down and then coming to that editing process where, okay, this particular paragraph doesn't sit well or it needs to go, making that decision and also communicating it in a way, it wasn't like, okay, this is bad writing or this is not a useful point. It was more of, this is useful, but maybe this doesn't sit here, maybe there's some way we can bring it into another newsletter or another point. So that was, I think, we kind of worked out those rhythms amongst ourselves to make those decisions. But yeah, Tamanna, Meredith, if you recall like disagreements, things that, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't say disagreements either, but I think it definitely took us a little bit of time to kind of find a rhythm almost, because we were also coming from very different perspectives and very different spaces we'd worked in before or interest areas. So I think trying to, and in some ways that was, I think, almost the ask of us at the beginning of the project also, to bring in those perspectives. So to, three people coming together with three different ways of wanting to say something or a style of writing. So I think the finding the tone of it was definitely a hard one. And in fact, even just like going back over the newsletter, something I noticed was how that changed right from the first one to the last one. It went through its own journey, and I think maybe after a point we also gave up in trying to keep it in a very specific set kind of way, because it felt like some topics were more like a story that you had to like really get deep into and like actually pull out and connecting it to more global newsy events almost, or things that were happening in the moment. Some newsletters felt like it needed a breakdown of what does this actually mean, for and I think some of, like, do we get into the process of it, do we get into how does the system work, do we get into what kind of resources the AI is using, or do we look at the more geopolitics of it? So I think that all of that kind of kept shifting depending on the topic we were kind of getting into. So yeah, not disagreements, but definitely how do we go from like 120 things to maybe putting down five that we really want to say was a process.
And Tammanna, maybe this is a good chance to also ask you a little bit about the artwork, right? I think one of the really cool things about the newsletter was that we worked with Nentara, who runs a studio based out of Goa, and we produced some really, really, really not just beautiful, but very informative and kind of provocative artworks, right? So, you want to say a little bit about what that process was like for you, like, kind of converting research into an infographic or artwork, because I know that's not easy, right? It takes a different kind of skill set.
Yeah, I think that was a really, again, like sort of a process that revealed itself in some ways. I feel like there are few that definitely come to mind in that one that were a bigger challenge in some ways. I remember the very like one of the first issues that we worked on was the energy grid that actually Meredith was really involved in as well. And trying to be like, we were like, what does an energy grid even look like? And I'm not sure why we decided that should be the infographic that we need to make, because it wasn't as simple and as straightforward as we thought an energy grid would even be. And then trying to figure out how different things plug in. So it almost felt like it was a subset of its own research that had to go in, and also finding how does it support what the rest of the newsletter is saying, because we'd spoken about so many different parts of in that same newsletter around the energy that we were like, okay, I think we need a layout of what the grid looks like. Or for example, in a later one, we're talking about data centers so much, but there is a that felt like a vast amount of research to try to fit into the text of the newsletter itself, to talk about what might, the many different kind of resources that get used, or the many different kinds of pollutions that are created, or the environmental impacts of it. It felt like just one visual could kind of communicate a lot of that. And that condensation process was fun, and I think like fed in by a lot of readings that happened in the process, and then kind of taking it to Nantara and being like, okay, here is what we want to say, here are the key points, this is maybe the way we can tell the story, and then for her to come in and actually give it a like a visual language, and actually play with it. And I think a lot of it was new for her as well. So again, I think the readings were really the grounding part of it, to pick out what is it that we want to say, and how do we supplement the rest of what we are saying in these newsletters as well.
Yeah, I think, like, the like at DFL, this idea of enhancing public engagement or growing our kind of public engagement work is quite important to us, and it's tough to do. It's not easy to kind of convert research into something that can be consumed by a kind of wider audience. And I think the artwork that we produced and the infographics that we produced really stood out for that. And I hope they have a life beyond this podcast as well. Maybe before we go into like the learnings of it, I'd love to know if any of you have a favorite episode.
I think my favorite was, of course, like the critical minerals one with Tom and Tamara. Just in the sense of it was a newer topic. It was quite insightful in laying out the landscape of how the intersection with AI is happening, and there were quite a few very good points that got touched on that particular podcast around labor, around the supply chain, etc. So it was very kind of like shift in thinking kind of episode for me, and that's also one of our episodes on the series that did the best in some sense. Like we had the most listeners, it reached a lot of wider kind of like audience. So that's also kind of testament to kind of like the impact of that episode in some sense.
I feel like this one was also my favorite. And this was also one of the ones that I listened in on. So I was present there for the conversation to happen, whereas for the rest of them, I wasn't because of the time difference issues. What I did really appreciate about that one was, I mean, being there and seeing how a lot of the research that we had been doing for the newsletter that was feeling so nascent, and that we had to do a lot of this. We had to do a good amount of our own connecting of nodes, right, and theorizing to kind of form a narrative. It wasn't as simple as challenges and opportunities. And I felt like Tom and Tamara, coming from two seemingly different spaces, and coming together and like really sharing and being like, oh, like, all of these points about labor, and all of the points about labor and all of the pieces in the supply chain, how there's this kind of these multi-scalar kind of questions of equity and promises of economic diversification and kind of knock-on effects of policy, and the role of corporations was very powerful, and I feel like really met the work that we were doing for the newsletter really well.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, I think one of the other cool things about Code Green was that it actually helped connect people in this space who wouldn't otherwise have necessarily spoken to each other or found each other, like Tom and Tamara. And, maybe that's one of the ways that some of this work kind of lives on, is through those networks and those collaborations that hopefully the podcast has seeded. Tamanna, what about you?
Mine was an early one that we did, which was on geospatial AI. I think I liked it just because of how early in the process it was as well, and it really stayed. But something I really enjoyed about it was that I think for the first time I was hearing two people who were really able to break down what was this process of map making look like using technology, and were able to actually lay it out in a way that someone stepping into the space for the first time could follow along and really understand it. And for me, that was the bit I'd been missing in a lot of conversations around technology, that can be start from a this is how the thing works first, and then get into what might be the upsides or downsides of it. So I think Isni and Kathy were able to do that really well for me, and also the kind of examples that they shared about how there are a few participatory methods that are used, how different people are using geo AI in their own ways for tracking environmental issues in their regions was really interesting. I think what was also cool as a and I think enjoying that podcast so much, that there was a paper of Isni's that I think I enjoyed reading so much that we kind of turned that into an infographic to show her research process, and were able to make that as part of a newsletter. So I think just that personal journey that it took me on, of like hearing it, being able to translate some of that research and get really deep into it, has very much stayed with me.
Yeah, I also really I enjoy the critical mineral ones definitely, but I also enjoy the geospatial AI. I think it was also one of the episodes that gave me some hope. I think very often, like I'm very critical of the use of AI in many spaces, and also are quite wary of the kind of hype around AI for climate action. But some of the applications that they were talking about really kind of stuck with me. Like there is really some a space here that we can expand, and there's an opportunity area that we can expand. And I think similarly for me, the conservation episode was also really interesting, on the role of kind of citizen science, and how we can use AI to support citizen science and get more people involved. And yeah, again, I think because my general tendency is to be quite skeptical, both of those episodes really forced me to challenge my own kind of thinking and assumptions. So maybe that's a nice kind of segue into kind of what we learned from Code Green, right? And Donna, maybe I can start with you. What is a kind of takeaway or a shift in perspective that happened for you through Code Green, and you think listeners should pay attention to, or you hope listeners also take away from Code Green?
I think a lot of it was just kind of bringing in that nuance in this conversation on AI and climate, especially around the environmental impacts of AI. And I distinctly remember, especially like the podcast with Sheriff and Cindy and with Priya and John, where in some ways everybody, both those episodes kind of delved into AI's environmental impacts and but the kind of perspective that both Sheriff and Priya brought into kind of how nuanced that conversation is, you can't be blanket talking about AI's environmental impacts. Like Gen AI has very different environmental impacts from other forms of machine learning. So just that kind of granularity that comes, like you don't have to talk about AI's environmental impacts in absolutes. It's not a zero sum game that AI being used for climate action means that AI is going to have debilitating environmental impacts. But what that also means is then you don't go about greening AI wholesale, right? And this was what Priya was also saying around like specific focusing on specific use cases, not pursuing this general purpose AI trajectory, but focusing on domains, on specific use cases, and then working towards reducing the emissions, carbon footprints of those technologies. That was one, I think, and that's kind of also informed my thinking, like throughout then the series, like just having that kind of information on hand. The other was something that Raj had said in the podcast on sustainable cities, where he started out with this fact that you're talking about smart cities, you're talking about technology for better cities. What people want at the end of the day is a good quality of life. And that was a very powerful statement. It also made a lot of sense that at the end of the day, like of course even if you want to use technology to improve, say potholes, like identify potholes on the road, you don't want to slip as you walk on the road, etc. So just to improve that quality of life, that kind of also becomes kind of like a premise for a lot of these interventions, right? Like, and at some point we kind of lose sight of like the climate vulnerable communities that these climate interventions have to work for. We kind of lose track of like ecology, of how all these technologies affect the environment. Just kind of like having that basic premise of, okay, like a good quality of life, which includes like the planet, the people, is I think like a good way to just also go about looking at tech solutions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's part of, what happens when you have this very top-down kind of frame of technology development, right? And also where you have kind of technologists leading the conversation and, they're super excited about the technology. They want to kind of push it, see how far it can go. And so they kind of come into the conversation trying to push the capabilities of the technology, often, not always, of course, rather than necessarily working the other way around, which is to say, what is the problem that I need to solve and what is the best technology that might be usable here, if anything at all, right? Donna, like in a different context, you and I also do some work on AI in the judiciary, and while you were speaking, for some reason it reminded me of that work, right, where you have all of these kind of new LLM applications for detecting kind of check bouncing cases, right, and generative AI and complex AI, where a really simple kind of rule based system would probably be enough to also identify a check bouncing case. So again, like you go in with the excitement of the technology rather than what the problem is at hand. Meredith, what is your takeaway or anything that stuck with you?
That is stuck. Jevon's paradox has stuck with me. And yeah, we kept seeing it again and again throughout other domains as well after the environmental costs newsletter, which is basically this old economic principle or phenomenon where, the more that you increase efficiency, the more resources will be used, or the more production will follow, basically. So it kind of led me to this question, seeing this come up, like, what is it if efficiency is kind of the metric that we're privileging here? What is it that we're really optimizing for? What is it that we're really striving for with efficiency is the bottom line, and what's being kind of missed, with that focus. And a few different speakers spoke to that as well. But yeah, I don't know. I think this was also where we came to digital degrowth, right? And that stuck with me after kind of seeing this trend throughout domains of are we just designing for more growth? At what point are we actually designing and creating to address, to do climate action and to address climate harms, rather than, designing for profit and to continued growth?
Yeah. No, I think that's such an important point, right? This question of what are we really optimizing for? because AI systems will optimize for something, right? And in some sense, also, if you improve the efficiency of current systems, you're also locking in the inequities baked into that current system. So if you are, if AI is going to be a transformative technology, then you also need it to, in some sense, optimize for a new politics altogether. If it keeps optimizing for the current kind of status quo, then it's business as usual, right? Not much really changes, and the current systems becomes more efficient. That being said, I mean, going back to what kind of Donna was saying, it is good, I think, to be bring kind of nuance into that conversation, right? Like there are plenty of spaces within the AI and climate kind of interface where there is work that is being done that is optimizing for community participation, that is optimizing for kind of empowerment, that is optimizing for sustainability. And and I think that's a little bit what the podcast also did, was how do we shine a light on those spaces, right? And how do we ensure that those are the spaces that get the attention, the resources, the funding that they really need, and we kind of break away from the hype around AI and climate. Tammanna, what about for you? What was a takeaway or shift in perspective that you'd like listeners to sit with?
I think there were a few, and I definitely, I think the degrowth point was a big one for me as well. But funny enough, I think what's been staying with me after has been I realized that we had a few guests that have a more almost an ethnographic practice within, in how they study technology and data systems. And I found that quite fascinating because it was almost pushing to say that I think someone used a term like, there needs to be like a situated understanding of what is the actual impact of technology and where it comes from. And that goes back to like wanting to know how do things work. And it's a very real thing to sometimes forget that it's not just the screen in front of you that is the system at work. We've spoken about the critical minerals, we've spoken of supply chains, that there is an entire industry working in the background for you to be having this interface with any kind of AI. And I think that fact of thinking like there is a physical place and there is there are like actual points in a map, or people who are affected, wildlife that gets affected along the way. And I think to be able to see that as a whole, and I think from people like Cindy and Kathy to, or even Anubha, I think at some point in the podcast had said that I just want people to go out and spend a year out in the field and actually understand what is it that is needed. To me that not I don't know if it's a shift in perspective, but that really solidified with each episode and each podcast that we did, that where is like what is the place we're talking about, because there is so much that goes on behind it. And I think it also connected for me very strongly with ideas of like environmental justice, or was a theme that also ran through each of the issues that we did. And I come from a law background, and I feel like that way of exploring justice is somewhere I've been kind of also growing my own practice of putting the site in the center and everything that comes with it. So, and I think this it not and I personally hadn't been thinking about technology that same way as well. I thought of the justice side of it, maybe the climate side of it, so this felt like a third very crucial layer to kind of consider. So maybe that, I think that would be my biggest takeaway. How do you look at it really tangibly rather than the cloud effect in some ways?
Yeah, yeah. Which I think is the tendency in a lot of work, right? Like at 30,000 feet, you in the air. Yeah. Donna, maybe, kind of then moving forward, what do you think kind of funders, policy makers, technologists, what are they overlooking? What are the things that you would like to see as a kind of priority agenda for funders and policymakers?
I think my response kind of goes back to the point of like what are we exactly optimizing for when it comes to AI for climate action, technology for climate action. So for funders, for organizations in this space to not lose track of that end goal of need mitigation, adaptation, building climate resilience using technology. And to use technology, of course, as a means and not as an end to solving the climate crisis, because this phenomenal research is already happening in climate research. In the climate space, there's a lot of harder decisions that climate advocates are arguing for, which needs more political will to move forward with. So to kind of not lose track of like that end goal of addressing climate action, and that would of course need more funding for like foundational research in this space, figuring out like also frameworks for understanding the long-term sustainability of some of these tech interventions, given how we're also seeing, like Tammanna is also saying, that it's not just that physical technology, there's a lot of infrastructure and maintenance that's needed, that's funding for communities to keep using those technologies. So funding and some like financing some of those fundamental frameworks to make sure that AI interventions or tech interventions or non-tech interventions do finally meet those very specific needs for climate.
Yeah. Tamana, anything you want to add to that?
I think I also want to maybe go back to my previous point around a kind of situated understanding, which would automatically also mean that you are working with the place and with the community to really understand what is needed and making that more participatory, simplifying some of the technicalities of what is going in. There was a case study we'd come across when we were talking about agriculture and how AI was being used to predict weather patterns, and how and that is that sort of understanding of reading the land and reading, the seasons and crops, and how wildlife and how biodiversity kind of responds to change in seasons is something that farmers have built over generations, that kind of knowledge, because that is their daily life. And sometimes for say something like an AI to come in and kind of tell them what it should be doesn't really work, because there is a huge amount of, I think, mistrust that also happens. And it's also like, who knows better? But the reality also feels like there is, like, climate really feels like this vastly unpredictable thing right now. Seasons don't follow the patterns that they always have. So is there a way to, for both of that to work together, that learning can feed each other? And I think that one case that you'd come across was really, I had kind of broken down what that process of co-building something had looked like. So it did feel like, another one of those like little points of like, maybe there is some sort of way to do that here that has been effective. But I think examples like that or an approach like that is perhaps what I would say feels like maybe we should be looking more at.
Yeah. Yeah. Meredith, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with both Donna and Tamana. I think what I would add would probably be that it just feels like a lot of the discourse right now is so centered on tech, and all of the solutions moving forward for climate action are so focused on profit. And if I was to like leave a message, with kind of change makers, it would be that we need to decenter both of those things in looking at pathways forward. A point that was really powerful to me in our climate finance newsletter was, this message from indigenous groups that we don't want any more false solutions, right? Like no more false solutions, no more carbon credits. Like we've learned and we've seen that those aren't the kind of mechanisms that we need. And to go along with that, I really appreciated Lewis's point from our last podcast, where he was talking about commoning, right? And he was kind of contextualizing the climate finance space and saying, like, look, in the first place, the financialization of climate is looking to a system that has actually led us to where we are right now. So I feel like being creative and kind of imagining solutions, or ways forward outside of what hasn't worked in the past, and learning from history.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe there's even a role that AI plays in that process, right? Helping build that kind of archive of what has worked, not worked, and helping make some of those decisions, or at least like shining a light on what has worked and not worked. Maybe then just a final question for three of you. Is there something that surprised you? Is there something in this conversation or in these episodes that as a result of these conversations you changed your mind on and you thought about it completely differently and now you have a new perspective? Donna, you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I think it was on the funding piece, and since we were kind of very clued into what was happening in the US in terms of like climate tech finance, climate finance in general, the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and just the kind of cascading effects of funding in this space. Our narrative, in some sense, like early on, was also that okay, this is going to affect Asia. Asia is not going to be isolated from these global shifts. But then as we started speaking to, I think one was when we were speaking with Raj, and one of our questions in the podcast was like, okay, how do we address the funding issue? And he was like, we don't have a funding issue. Like, and he spoke from his experience in Chennai, in India. He's like, Chennai is sitting on a lot of money. Like the city is sitting on a lot of money. So for like smart cities, sustainable cities, they do have the kind of financing that they need to do good interventions. It's more about like finding the right people, the right expertise to come in and kind of make that bridge between like a tech expertise and like a policy planner in figuring out what those good interventions are to improve quality of life. And then similarly, when we were speaking to Hanuan in our last podcast episode on the climate financing, and she was like, Asia doesn't have a funding, and this is someone who works in the climate tech space, works on AI and climate. Like Asia has enough funding, like different countries in Asia. Of course, there might be some intra-regional disparity when it comes to the amount of funding, but countries like India, China, Japan are spending money on climate. And she also made this good point around how a lot of private funders, like companies, technology companies, are investing in climate schools in Asia, in China in particular. So there is also that, just that kind of, so I guess like my point is also that the focus on funding has generally, a narrative is that, oh, we don't have enough funds, and that's also what we also, of course, hear from a lot of organizations. But it's perhaps like a broader question of like distribution of funds. There seem to be like pockets of funding, and how do we make the most of the funding and make sure that gets distributed to local communities, to communities of practice, to kind of build that bottom up approach. So yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm glad you kind of surfaced that. Tamanna, anything for you?
I mean, a big one that came from like this one read where around how subsea cables are repaired, which are like a crucial part of the infrastructure around tech, was that how underspoken maintenance is just not a conversation that comes up. And I think like when I read that one piece and like saw the effort that goes into, I think I called it like how to keep the industry afloat almost. I was like, wow, why did they take this long into the process to even come across like a really in-depth piece of work around it? And it was funny because after that, we also kept referencing, I think Meredith had brought it up about like abandoned infrastructure that is just there like once like a big piece of the infrastructure is built and then you move on. Like I think mines are of course an example, but even just like data centers, or like I think there was an example in like China or somewhere where there are these cities that have been built and then you move on like sort of. So it just felt like after that one thing about maintenance, it went into like abandonment, and that was entirely new, and that was kind of crazy to think that it's there, but that just doesn't, that like you were talking about mainstream narratives right at the beginning. I really don't think that's out there or spoken about enough at all.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, not sure what to do with it, but it kind of hit me.
For sure. No, and I mean, both points, right? The maintenance for sure, and even the abandonment. That's not something that even I had thought about earlier or had a kind of mental image of earlier. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the extension of the maintenance question, right? Then you just have abandoned infrastructure.
I think when we're talking about renewable energy so much, and I think the only point where it had come up on was when we were talking about solar power and like these abandoned solar farms, or the fact that it hadn't picked up because no one had taken the effort to train people how to repair and maintain this equipment that had been kind of bought into the space. So, yeah.
Meredith, anything that stood out for you?
Yeah. not to jump on this train, but yeah, definitely kind of the thinking about like the externalities of hypergrowth and these like boom and bust hype cycles, like what's actually left behind.
Maybe just one last question before we kind of close. What would each of you like to work on? Like, where would you like to kind of take this conversation? Are there pieces of this at the intersection of AI and climate that you would be keen to explore further? And maybe this is a call out to folks in the ecosystem to help us take this work further, to support some of these questions you might want to ask. Donna, again, maybe I'll start with you, and then Tamanna and Meredith.
Sure. I think like two pieces. One is the critical minerals and AI supply chain intersection in India's context. Right? Like giving India is also like the government's opening up new mining blocks, and there is a lot of interest in kind of maintaining or reclaiming sovereignty for critical minerals. How would that play out? And one of the critical pillars of that conversation is also to kind of aid in tech transformation for the country, digital transformation. So to see how that plays out in the communities around these mining infrastructures as well, contextualize some of that in for India, for Asia, because a lot of the work that we're also seeing right now is in South America, is in other contexts. So to figure that out, the other is around the Urushi, like as you were mentioning, the AI and conversation, conservation, AI, AI and conservation piece. That was also interesting for me in just this kind of like almost hopeful technology in that space, right? It just seems like a space that has been using data, has been using large amounts of data. But then, as Eleanor was mentioning in her podcast around, like they do get stuck in these spaces of just keep collecting data. You're collecting hours and hours of data, and you're using about 10 minutes of that data. So, what are some frameworks that folks in that space could also use to kind of do better tech, use tech properly, or like in a responsible, safe, trustworthy manner? And I'm sure like there's already a lot of work that's happening in that space. So, kind of just to surface some of that work with conservationists, work with some experts in this space. I was also speaking to someone who works at this intersection of AI and conservation recently, and they were saying one of their biggest challenges is in communicating. Right, as a technologist, as an AI/ML scientist, communicating with a manager who has to make sure that a particular area needs to be conserved, is working with a nonprofit, working with a conservation organization. So just kind of like the different vocabularies that these different stakeholders also have, making those bridges. I think that would be like another space that I would love to work on if given the chance.
Yeah, I hope there's some funders listening to this. I think both those are, or all three of those, are really important spaces, and I'd be equally excited to work on them. Tamana, what about you?
I'm gonna sound like I'm just repeating everything Donna said, but but I remember there was a discussion about like maybe like going out and kind of just understanding how an entire community gets built up around a data center, and I think that becoming one of those key infrastructure points that a lot of things have a fallout from, and feeling like that's every day it almost, I mean, maybe not every day, but it does feel like every time you look at the news there's like yet another announcement of yet another center coming up, and without really knowing what it means to live in that space around it, or what it does to change the entire setup of a city, or how people live in it. So I think kind of studying it from that perspective is something that I'm still keen to do, and I think it does connect back to the critical minerals piece also. It's just like it's part of that same chain, and like where we choose to focus on. And yeah, I think also echoing Donna on the conservation bit, is a good one. Like, and again, credit to Meredith for bringing this lovely piece of reading under the table, which kind of spoke about just good enough data when we're talking about citizen science. I think as a phrase, that has really, really stuck with me as well. And in fact, there's a project I'm working on now that's kind of looking at how, what kind of data gets accepted as evidence, especially when we're talking about environmental justice in courts. And that kind of became a hook for me to kind of go into that question even further. And yes, it's true. I think like when Robin and Elena were talking about the kind of data they gather in these vast quantities, they were coming from a scientific perspective. But when citizens are also doing that all the time, you're taking photos, you're recording things, where does it go? What does it amount to? Is it like, can it actually be useful from in a scientific or a legal framework? So it's kind of going on that tangent. But I think and why that phrase felt really important is because it does get into some of the ethics around the data collection as well, and who gets to collect this data and of what. At some point, I think Donna had said this, it's like, I don't know if the birds and animals are very happy with us just recording their conversations all the time. And I was like, wasn't thinking of it like that, but it's true. And I feel like those add, like we were talking about nuance, and those add those layers in. So yeah, I think that those would be two that I'm keen to get further into.
Yeah, I love this idea of just good enough data. I think there's a lot to kind of unpack there. Yeah, and I think the fact that you're echoing some of what Donna says only kind of underlines the importance of doing that work, and hopefully it's something that we can all do together very soon.
I think I would say that more funding should go towards really exploring the kinds of scaffolding needed to make meaningful participation possible in building equitable climate tech. As we were working on the final newsletter, a core theme that came up when we were reviewing, the series as a whole and all of our expert contributions and newsletters was this theme of how challenging stakeholder alignment is and all the difficulties in bridging disparate interests between different actors. So users, researchers, funders, developers, and local decision makers all have different motivations and needs and things that they need to be included in the conversation and have those needs met. Some of the opportunities that experts highlighted or the critical needs to make this happen are things like critical AI literacy, explainable AI, and accessible and transparent language as just, some parts of that conversation that can facilitate better dialogue and participation within projects. Also, and maybe I'm biased in terms of, dialogue and participation across sectors, at the policy and research level, this collaboration within Code Green was super powerful to me. I feel like more conversations need to be had on AI and climate tech that really see environmental concerns as inextricable from social impacts and social elements in tech development. And I feel like that was really what we did and a main focus of ours in this project, almost as an emergent factor. So, lastly, I think I would say that, throughout the process of working on this project, there were so many things that were happening internationally, that were really injustices and made it kind of difficult to stay focused on justice and hopeful about tech in the state of the world. And honestly, coming back to meetings with Donna and Tammanna and to this project was a bit of a hopeful exercise for me. It really staved off some tech pessimism. I think, one of the objectives of this project was to establish, these expert networks and international dialogues while focusing on the Asian region. And even within the team, that's what this project did. Working across time zones with these two was really awesome. And so I think more projects like this, should be funded and should be prioritized. I would love to deep dive on any of the topics that Donna and Tammanna surfaced. Because working with this team was special, working with this organization was special, and this nexus is critical. So I'm hoping that we see, a lot more after Code Green has ended.
Great. Well, thank you all for sharing the process behind making a podcast. I don't think we get to hear that very often. I think listeners often underestimate the kind of work that goes into it, especially on a topic like this, which is really a kind of new space for most. So really appreciate the effort that you all put into it. And hopefully, like I was saying earlier, one of the outcomes of this is that we've also created a larger kind of community of folks working in this space and help connect them. And I hope we can kind of grow that community and sustain that community. So thank you for doing that work, and thank you also for bringing this amazing scholarship and all these insights to a larger community. And hopefully we can continue doing work in this space. Thank you for tuning in. I hope this behind the scenes look gave you fresh insights. For long-time listeners, we hope these conversations have sparked new ideas or even some discomfort that will encourage you to rethink how AI and climate intersect. If this is your first episode, explore more at codegreen.asia. We'd love to keep this work alive with our community of listeners and readers. If you have collaboration ideas or see connections with our work, do reach out at codegreen@digitalfutureslab.in. Until next time, I'm Arvishi Aneja on behalf of Digital Futures Lab. Thank you for listening.